The young and the restless spoilers from the outside looking in, it might have seemed like Kyle was slowly rediscovering himself, his charm, his ambition, and perhaps, even the idea of a second chance at love. After all, he had been through enough heartbreak to last a lifetime. His whirlwind romance and marriage to Claire had begun with intensity, promise, and redemption, offering him a sense of stability and emotional grounding that he hadn't known since the tumultuous days with Summer. But lately, as the shadow of Victor Newman loomed ever larger over Genoa City, Kyle had unknowingly become a pawn in a much darker game, one orchestrated not out of love or concern for his happiness, but out of cold calculation, power, and control. And at the center of that manipulation stood Audra Charles. Audra, with her signature red lips, steely glances, and poised confidence, was everything Victor needed in an operative. Smart, seductive, morally ambiguous, and fiercely loyal to her own advancement. She didn't need to fall in love with Kyle to use him. In fact, the absence of genuine affection made her mission easier. Victor had long suspected that Claire was hiding something, perhaps that her rehabilitation and transformation were incomplete, or that her loyalty to the Newman family remained shaky at best. By driving a wedge between Kyle and Claire, Victor could test Claire's stability, expose any remaining weaknesses, and, if necessary, eliminate her from the Newman dynasty entirely. And Audra would be his scalpel, carefully carving through the threads of trust, love, and commitment until Kyle stood isolated, confused, and dependent on Audra's version of the truth. To the outside world, Kyle and Audra's interactions appeared to be part of a professional collaboration. After all, they were working together on several projects involving Chancellor Winters and Newman Media. There were board meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and corporate events that often ended with drinks and whispers about mutual goals. Claire, who had tried to give Kyle space and trust, found herself increasingly unsettled by these late meetings and the growing intimacy she saw in Audra's body language. There was an ease in the way Audra touched Kyle's arm when she laughed, a possessiveness in the way she leaned in during conversations, and a faint but unmistakable scent of Audra's perfume that clung to Kyle's suits more frequently. Claire didn't want to become paranoid, but her instincts told her something was deeply off. And so, she began watching, listening, waiting, not as a jealous wife, but as a woman trying to protect what she believed was true love from being dismantled by lies. Kyle, for his part, was not innocent, but he wasn't guilty either. He hadn't crossed the line, at least not yet. There was a magnetism between him and Audra that he couldn't deny. She was clever, confident, and endlessly fascinating in a way that fed into the part of Kyle that craved validation and excitement. Audra made him feel wanted in a way Claire's quiet affection sometimes failed to do. But Kyle still loved Claire. He remembered the tears in her eyes on their wedding night, the way she had fought for his forgiveness when her past threatened to derail their relationship, and the fragile tenderness she had shown in moments when no one else could reach him. He had not forgotten what they had built, he was simply losing sight of it under the intoxication of flattery, ego, and deception. Claire decided she couldn't rely on suspicion alone. She needed proof. Something that would either restore her faith in Kyle or shatter the illusion entirely. So she followed him. She checked his calendar for inconsistencies, his phone for unexplained calls, and one evening, she overheard Kyle mentioning a suite number during a hushed phone call. It was at a boutique hotel, one they had once stayed in together during a weekend getaway. Something about the familiarity of the location stung. If he were meeting Audra there, then he had already crossed an emotional line, even if their clothes hadn't come off yet. Claire didn't cry. She didn't confront him. Instead, she booked a room, just one floor below, and waited. That night, everything unfolded with eerie precision. Audra arrived first, entering the room with a swipe of a keycard Victor had procured for her in advance. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't pour herself a drink. She simply crawled under the bed and waited, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable. It wasn't fear that made her hide, it was control. She wanted to see, to hear, to witness Kyle's choices without interference, to be absolutely certain that her plan was working. Minutes later, Kyle entered, loosening his tie, clearly expecting a quiet evening with a colleague. But what began as a recap of the day's work soon morphed into an embrace, then a kiss. It was hesitant at first, then more urgent. Hands found buttons. Shirts slid to the floor. Bodies pressed close, breath mingled. And all the while, Claire watched from a camera she had secretly installed through the hotel security system, her face pale, her chest hollow. It didn't matter that they hadn't made it to the bed. It didn't matter that Kyle had whispered, "Are you sure?" and Audra had hesitated just long enough to suggest doubt. The betrayal was already complete. It was in the way he kissed her, the way he touched her face, the way he forgot about Claire entirely in that moment. Audra didn't feel guilt, this was the apex of her assignment. She had broken the barrier. Now, she could pull back, act confused, act hurt, make Kyle question himself, and draw him deeper into the abyss of emotional ambiguity. Victor would be pleased. Claire would be discarded. And Kyle? Kyle would become exactly what Victor wanted. A man in need of rebuilding, of new purpose, of new allegiance. But something shifted that night. As Kyle stared at himself in the mirror afterward, shirtless and shaken, he couldn't lie to himself. He had crossed a line. It wasn't about sex, it was about intimacy, about seeking something in Audra that he should have protected with Claire. He didn't know Audra's motives. He didn't suspect the full extent of Victor's involvement. But for the first time, he doubted her sincerity. Her eyes were too cold, her smile too composed. She hadn't trembled when he kissed her. She hadn't even closed her eyes. And when she left, she didn't look back. That, more than anything, haunted him. Claire didn't confront him immediately. She needed to understand why. Was it about power? Was it about insecurity? Or was there something darker at play? She began tracing back Audra's recent movements, and what she uncovered stunned her. A series of encrypted messages, all traced back to Victor's private channels. A suspicious trip to Newman Tower after hours. A phone call from Tucker that ended abruptly the moment Claire's name was mentioned. The web of deceit was wider than she imagined. And Kyle wasn't just betraying her, he was being used. What Claire did next would define everything. She didn't scream. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she made a quiet vow to destroy the entire plan from within. She would not only expose Audra, but make sure Victor knew that underestimating her had been his greatest mistake. And as for Kyle, if he truly regretted what he had done, if he had even the slightest desire to save what they had, he would have to fight for it. Not with flowers. Not with apologies. But with truth. With transparency. With a willingness to see Audra for what she truly was, the venom-wearing perfume. The game had changed. The lines had been drawn. And in Genoa City, love was never just love, it was a battlefield of power, of legacy, of survival. And Claire, once the underestimated girl with a dark past, was about to become the storm no one saw coming. Let me know if you'd like a continuation or version from Claire's inner thoughts, Victor's strategy, or Kyle's guilt unraveling over time. Under the dim flicker of the hotel room's soft lighting, Claire kept her body still and her breath shallow, hidden from sight but burning with the intensity of a woman betrayed. Her fingers clutched the phone tighter as she watched, every second seared into her memory like a scar she would never be rid of. She had positioned herself perfectly, not under the bed, but behind the concealed wall panel through the service corridor, the camera and audio feeding directly to her phone. She saw the way Kyle touched Audra, the way he let go of his hesitation, the way his voice softened, lips pressed to a woman who wasn't his wife, a woman he had sworn was just a business partner. Claire had come here for clarity, but now clarity was a blade slicing through every vein of her trust. Her eyes stung, but she refused to blink. Refused to cry. Because tears would give it too much grace, too much softness, and this was war. If she had let herself act on the storm building inside her, she would have thrown the door open, dragged Audra from that bed by her hair, and slapped Kyle so hard his conscience would have shattered into pieces he could never pick up. But Claire was too strategic for that. She knew that outrage in the moment could be dismissed, twisted, made into drama. No, this needed to sink in like poison. It needed to metastasize. She bit her lip, hard enough to draw blood, and quietly exited the hotel. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. But as she walked away into the night, every step she took was a vow they would both pay. The next morning, Kyle greeted her like nothing had happened. That, more than the betrayal itself, made her sick to her stomach. He wrapped his arms around her waist with faux tenderness, brushed his lips over her forehead, and asked if she wanted breakfast in bed. The audacity. The pure, vile gall of a man who could so easily live a double life. She looked into his eyes and saw no guilt, just the polished routine of a man who had rehearsed this kind of deception long enough to be fluent in it. Inside, she wanted to scream. But outside, she smiled. Let him think he'd gotten away with it. Let him underestimate her just a little longer. That would make the fall so much sweeter. As for Audra, she played her role with her usual effortless elegance. She didn't mention the night before, didn't linger too long, didn't overplay her hand. But Claire saw the smugness in her eyes, the quiet triumph of a woman who believed she'd won. And perhaps, in some twisted sense, Audra thought she had. But Claire understood something neither Kyle nor Audra ever would: hell hath no fury like a woman who has tasted betrayal and chooses silence as her weapon. Claire didn't cry herself to sleep that night. She stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, making a list in her mind, not of people to destroy, but of truths to expose. She would not leave Kyle. Not yet. That would be too merciful. Too expected. No, she would let him believe everything was fine. Let him bask in the illusion that his wife was clueless and his mistress discreet. Then, when he was at his most comfortable, most unguarded, she would tear it all down. Emails. Photos. Security logs. Audio clips. Claire began gathering them all. She had learned from the best. After all, she had been raised in a world of psychological warfare, where every smile concealed a blade. And if Victor Newman thought she was weak, if he believed she wouldn't fight for what was hers, he was about to learn just how deep the waters of her wrath could run. She would make sure the whole city saw Audra not as the poised executive, but as the manipulative pawn Victor had used to corrupt a marriage. And Kyle. Kyle would have to watch everything he built, everything he thought was safe, crumble around him while Claire stood there, stone-faced, as the last brick fell. Forgiveness was off the table. Mercy was extinct. Claire wouldn't scream, wouldn't beg for an apology, wouldn't demand explanations. She would give Kyle something much worse than guilt: she would give him clarity. She would hold up a mirror to his actions so sharp it would slice through every excuse. And when he tried to crawl back, when he offered tears and remorse, she would already be gone, her silence louder than any vengeance he could have anticipated. Because this wasn't about heartbreak anymore. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming power in a world where women like Claire were expected to break quietly. But Claire wasn't quiet. She wasn't broken. She was becoming something else entirely. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something unforgettable. And by the time Kyle realized it, it would already be far too late. Victor Newman believed he had seen it all. He had conquered empires, dismantled rivals, manipulated governments and CEOs alike, and emerged each time with the same cold smirk of superiority. So when he devised his latest plan, assigning Audra Charles the deceptively simple task of destroying Kyle Abbott's marriage to Claire Grace and stealing the rights to the burgeoning Vibrante Cosmetics brand, he considered it a mere footnote in the grander narrative of Newman domination. To Victor, it was business, strategy, and justice neatly packaged into one operation. But what he miscalculated, for the first time in decades, was the volatility of emotion. He underestimated not just the tangled web of desire and resentment between Kyle and Audra, but the raw, explosive chemical reaction waiting to ignite the moment they were in the same room again. Audra accepted the mission like it was a tailored glove slipping perfectly onto her hand. She was cool, sharp, and mercilessly efficient, everything Victor prized in an operative. Her disdain for Kyle's decision to exile her from Glissade still simmered beneath her perfectly painted exterior, and she saw this mission not only as an opportunity to prove her loyalty to Victor but also to avenge the humiliation Kyle had subjected her to. And stealing Vibrante, Claire's pride and joy, would be the cherry on top. Audra wasn't just executing a corporate hit, she was setting the stage for an emotional coup d'état. What she didn't anticipate, or perhaps had quietly hoped for in the most buried part of her psyche, was that the moment she and Kyle locked eyes in Paris, standing amid the opulence of Aristotle Dumas's castle gala, the air would go thin with tension. Their bodies had memory, and that memory remembered everything. The betrayal. The desire. The nights spent planning and plotting. The laughter that only came easily between two people who had once fallen hard and burned out just as spectacularly. That energy wasn't gone, it had simply been lying dormant, waiting for the right kind of spark. And Paris, with its golden lights, champagne haze, and moral flexibility, was the perfect ignition point. Victor, of course, watched from afar, reading reports, interpreting security footage, receiving updates through encrypted channels. Everything seemed on track. Kyle and Audra were attending events together under the guise of joint business expansion. Claire, meanwhile, remained in Genoa City, focused on Vibrante's product launch, unaware of the smoldering wildfire building abroad. But Victor didn't see the look in Kyle's eyes at the rooftop dinner overlooking the Seine. He didn't hear the tremble in Audra's voice when Kyle brushed her hand. He didn't feel the way time folded in on itself when they stood too close near the marble bar, sipping cocktails laced with old memories. To Victor, this was strategy. To Kyle and Audra, it was temptation served with a vintage Bordeaux. At Dumas's gala, when the two arrived arm in arm, Kyle in a classic black tuxedo, Audra in crimson silk that clung to her body like flame. The murmurs among the international elite were instant. People didn't see two professionals, they saw lovers dancing a dangerously choreographed tango. And when they did dance, the tension was electric. Hands gripping too tightly, bodies brushing too intimately, eyes locked in something too fierce to fake. It was no longer about Claire. It wasn't even about Victor. It was about the one thing both Kyle and Audra hated to admit: they never really got over each other. And the fallout of pretending otherwise would soon be catastrophic. The fireworks, literal and figurative, came later that night. The Dumas estate, lit by 100 torches and the pulsing hum of classical music, seemed to bend around them as they slipped into the garden, away from the crowd. There were no cameras. No Claire. No Victor. Just Kyle, drunk on wine and proximity, and Audra, high on the power of having him so close. Their kiss wasn't soft. It was furious, messy, tangled in half-sentences and whispered regrets. It wasn't revenge, it was surrender. And in that moment, as clothing came undone and secrets fell between them like discarded silk, they weren't thinking of consequences. They were thinking only of now. But the next morning, reality had its claws out. Kyle awoke early, the sun creeping through the French drapes like judgment. Audra lay beside him, her face unreadable, her eyes open but distant. For a brief second, Kyle considered pretending it didn't happen. That they could go back to business meetings and polite detachment. But he knew better. He knew Audra. She didn't do casual. Not with him. And now that the lines had been crossed, the map would never look the same. Back in Genoa City, Claire felt the shift without needing a confession. She felt it in the way Kyle's voice hesitated during their video calls, in the way he spoke of Paris as if it were just a city and not the site of his unraveling. She had long known something was off. Audra's name came up too often. The way Kyle avoided discussions about Vibrante's international deals raised red flags. And her instincts, the same ones that had helped her survive a childhood of manipulation, screamed that this wasn't just business. It was betrayal. But Claire didn't pack her bags. She didn't confront Kyle the moment he returned. She smiled. She waited. And then, when Kyle least expected it, she hacked his secure cloud. What she found wasn't just damning, it was cinematic. Surveillance stills from the Dumas party. A room service bill with Audra's signature on a suite Kyle had booked. A single image from a garden camera Victor had missed, a kiss, unmistakable, undeniable. Claire didn't cry. She didn't scream. She printed the photos and slid them neatly into an envelope labeled simply, "For when I stop pretending." Victor still thought he was winning. Audra thought she was ahead. Kyle thought he could keep spinning plates. But Claire was already building her revenge, not in fury, but in precision. She reached out to Nate, secured her majority shares in Vibrante, and rewrote the bylaws so no Newman-backed investor could touch it. Then she called Ashley. Together, they plotted a counterstrike so swift that when the news broke, it would implode the very foundation Victor had tried to build with Audra's mission. But she wasn't done. At a press conference meant to unveil Vibrante's European expansion, Claire arrived in white, like a ghost, like an angel, like judgment itself. Audra flinched when she saw her. Kyle went pale. And Claire, with the calm of a woman who had already survived the worst, took the stage and said, "Vibrante was built on truth, passion, and integrity. Qualities some people in this room have forgotten. But don't worry, I'm here to remind them." What followed wasn't a speech. It was an exposure. Photos projected on the screen. Contracts altered and backdated by Audra. A live audio clip of her drunkenly confessing Victor's role to a Parisian bartender. It was surgical. Beautiful. Brutal. Victor watched from his office, jaw clenched, knowing he'd lost not only control but also the illusion of control.